to have. So as we wait for, well, good afternoon again. As we wait for the presentation to be lined up, there is a housekeeping announcement, and that is in regard to COVID testing for those who are traveling out of the country, the participants who are traveling out of the country. The team that is going to conduct the testing is here already, and they're in the Secretariat room. I think most of you are now familiar with where the Secretariat room is. Two ladies seated outside here will be picking a bunch of 2 or 3 people to go over the test and then come back. So just stay put. You'll be approached, and you need to bring your passport with you, because the COVID test certificate needs to reflect exactly how your name is captured in the passport. So just carry your passport with you. But if you have also submitted a copy of your passport to the Secretariat and you had left it in your room, don't worry about that. I think we can facilitate. Having said that, I wish to call the meeting to order. And this afternoon we have only one presentation. I think we realize that you have been very attentive and giving us all your time. So we are going to have only one presentation this afternoon, and this is in, let me get it correct. The presentation is entitled State of Infrastructure and Trade Facilitation in the Region. And with the region, we are referring to the Igad region. This particular presentation is being made by our good friends from Trademark East Africa. We are privileged to have Bishak Sharma with us. Bishak is a senior director at Trade East Africa, and he's in charge of transport, the transport docket at Trademark East Africa. In his role, he supports regional integration and trade competitiveness, so in East Africa. And therefore, it sits very well with our theme. He does this by helping infrastructure agencies prepare and finance key transport and logistics facilities. Bishak has an experience spanning about 20 years, and during this time, he has worked on the entire value chain of infrastructure development, from strategy to implementation, as well as financing. He has also worked in a number of developing countries, mostly in Asia and Africa, for a variety of institutions, including national and state governments. He has also worked with infrastructure developers, private sector equity companies, as well as several development finance institutions. I would go on and on, but I'll leave it there and invite Bishak to take the floor and make his presentation. You're most welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. I know it's the post-lunch session, so I'll try to keep it as lively as possible. First, can I request the presentation to be put up? So yeah, I mean, as my good friend was saying, essentially, what I want to focus on today, infrastructure is this hot theme we all know. I mean, one of the biggest reasons for the success of the Roman Empire were the roads that they created, which allowed them to be a superpower of the world for hundreds of years. I think the biggest known superpower. So we are all converts here. We all know the importance of infrastructure to trade and to move trade faster. And we all know the impact that it creates on it. So what I'd want to do is to quickly take this opportunity to highlight a few of the trends that we are seeing around financing, around integration, around marrying soft and hard infrastructure and others to spark a discussion. Really looking forward to questions around that. So the next slide, please. Just very quickly for people who don't know, Trademark East Africa, we are a multi-donor aid for trade organization. We operate in 13 countries now, including in the Horn, in the EAC countries, as well as in Zambia, Mozambique, and Malawi. And then we are also now starting to work in West Africa with the AFCFTA Secretariat on various projects. And there we have a new partnership with FDB, and that's where we are going to be looking at doing some of the work in the future. We work with governments, we work with the RECs in our region. We are closely working with Igad, for example, on what we call the Safe Trade Project, essentially a COVID responsiveness project. We also work with the private sector and civil society organizations. And just in terms of what we've been doing, so we have been around for around 11 years now. And in the period, we have raised and have invested roughly around $1.2 billion in different kinds of infrastructure, both hard and soft, as well as digital systems and others in the region. Sorry, the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is, again, I mean, we are a group of converts, so I don't want to take a lot of time on it, but the question is, why do we need this infrastructure practically? Because sometimes it becomes a bit more around, these fancy projects which everyone wants to develop. But here the basic situation, if we take any of the industries, for example, one of the rapidly growing export sectors in our region, especially Kenya, and also was in Ethiopia, was the garment sector. Now there, if you look at it, we have in Kenya been exporting around $400 million worth of garments for the last 10 years. We haven't been able to grow it much. There is a lot of investor interest in our region, but we have a number of challenges because of which our export numbers are not growing. We have very expensive industrial spaces and warehousing space in our region. So there are so many players from, let's say, Sri Lanka or India or others who want to come and establish facilities here because of the AGOA law, which allows us to export duty-free to the US. However, you don't have the facilities for them to come and put up their factories. Second, our transport system, even though the costs have come down significantly, continues to be very expensive. And also very unpredictable in terms of the time that it takes to move products from from let's say Nairobi, or actually now Naivasha, which is becoming, hopefully will become the center of production because of the cheap power available. But even then, moving the products back to the ports to be shipped outside continues to be expensive, but more than that, it continues to be unpredictable. So there is a lot of investment still needed around that. And then we also have our other logistics challenges that exist in terms of the companies that are, the solutions that are offered in a region. So there is a whole host of things, with infrastructure being at the center of what needs to be done to make sure that we become more competitive. Next slide, please. Now this is how we look at infrastructure in our region. So on the left, it looks like a tube map from London or anywhere, but the green one is the northern corridor, the yellow one is the central corridor, the red one is the Uhuru corridor. And essentially what we look at are different nodes. So we look at the whole thing like a pipeline where, you know, just doing projects at one part of the pipeline. For example, if you have a very efficient port, but the road network is not efficient, then you will soon see blockages. Sorry, can we have the presentation back, please? Okay, this one has disappeared, which makes it a bit awkward. Can we have it back on here? Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so we have this, and our own experience. So in what we call as strategy 1 of Trademark, which was 2010 to 2017, we invested nearly 54% of our funding into hard infrastructure, so at the border posts and the ports, as well as on IT infrastructure, single window systems, customs, work with customs, trade portals, etc. And there was a massive independent evaluation done by our donors, and they found that through the work that we did on infrastructure and IT systems, we were able to increase exports from the region by around $549 million annually, and the imports increased by around 145 million. This was just because of the reduction in costs that happened because of the work that we did. So this is just attributable to Trademark. Other institutions have contributed to the even bigger numbers. And then the time saving that happened because of this better infrastructure and systems also led to an additional $102 million worth of exports. So whenever we talk about infrastructure, really we are talking about increasing the exports from our region, which is critical if you are able to achieve fiscal parity in our region. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, one of the key things, I think, which we're all aware of, which we're all discussing, is the CFTA. And for us, the one simple thing is, for us to be able to trade more within Africa, our borders need to allow us to trade more within Africa. Now, if you look at it, there is just as a first step itself, there are hundreds of borders in between our countries which need to be improved just for trade to flow in a reasonable way. So today, for example, a lot of investment has gone into an Addis-Mombasa corridor. But because of several challenges around at the border, around trade facilitation, around where the trucks drive, you still have, it costs almost $8,000 for a truck to move from Mombasa to Addis. So it's not really a corridor which anyone can use even now. So there is a lot that needs to happen. And then we have similar situations all over because of our colonial past in Africa, we have corridors which move from our hinterland straight to the ports to export and import from international countries. We have never really thought about trade within ourselves. So a lot of realignment needs to happen. So when we talk about infrastructure across Africa, and if we are to look at prioritizing border posts, we feel, our experience, the key thing to look at, of course, with road infrastructure, which allows trade to move. The next slide, please. The other thing which is happening, which we also need to look at, is this increased pressure that we will see on reducing greenhouse emissions on our corridor. So while within Africa we are looking at a lot of projects and we are looking at more and more road traffic following on our corridors, I think the corridor, sorry, I have no idea what's going on. The corridor from Mombasa to Nairobi is the only corridor which is getting a level of multimodality. There is a good quality functional railway that exists. The road corridor is also in a reasonable shape. And on the northern corridor, if you look at it, Mombasa to Nairobi carries almost, I think, around 65% of the traffic that moves along the northern corridor. So it's bulk of the traffic moves here. There is real multimodality here. This pressure is going to come on other corridors as well, as you will see governments in our region being pushed more and more to reduce emissions on our corridor. So we would strongly have to look at, railway might not be possible everywhere because of the cost, but lakes and multimodality through the lakes and the road network is something that has to be looked at in a strong way. And that's the other message we have to look at. As we're looking to develop infrastructure, you have to strongly consider the multimodality aspect of infrastructure. Next slide, please. However, when we're doing multimodality, so this is, sorry, it's a very busy slide, but what I wanted to highlight was, and I will summarize it for you, and then, of course, every one of us is going to receive these slides, is that when we implemented the railway on the Nairobi-Mombasa corridor, it actually led to increase in costs for our exporters and importers. Because of the way railway functions, because of the way the customs got organized around clearance of cargo, so the port shifted for all the Nairobi-bound cargo from Mombasa to Nairobi, and this led to increase in costs. So that's the other thing. As planners, when we are looking at these projects, we don't have to just look at the technical solutions and whether they will work or not. We also need to look at the cost to the business of the infrastructure. So for example, creating a brand new port on a lake port and then forcing cargo to move through it might look great from a technical feasibility perspective, but if it doesn't work for the business perspective, then you will end up harming the region, which in this case, the government is working very hard to ensure that the parity is brought in. We are going back, but this should be part of the planning. Next slide, please. The other thing which even we discovered, and all of us discovered, is that we have never really incorporated health in any big way in our transport planning and infrastructure planning. But COVID-19 very quickly showed us that no matter what the infrastructure is, if you don't have contingency plans around these emergencies, then the situation, like this is a famous photo. I mean, we have all seen these multi-kilometer lines. We saw on our border post transit times shot up on most of the border posts that they were in. So the other thing is, I think we all need to consider Ministry of Health as a key partner in some of our projects. Even for us, this was a big learning, and we realized we just did not know anyone there. A lot of our interventions, for example, at the beginning, was to get PPEs and delivered at the different borders, and that allowed our borders in East Africa to remain open when a number of border posts in West Africa, for example, actually closed down fully. So we came out with an emergency plan, PPE delivery, as well as a driver tracking app. So, there was COVID certification. No one trusted each other's COVID certification, especially the paper certificate. So we came up with a system around that. And when we're doing those projects, we recognize that we just don't have expertise in these areas. And, we had to forge brand new partnerships, which take time. So that's another thing. When we're looking at infrastructure, we have to plan for these health emergencies and how they might impact, because countries tend to close down very quickly around these emergencies. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, the other thing we need to look at is the funding for infrastructure. I was having an interesting conversation at lunch that a lot of funding for infrastructure is available, but our own experience is that given the size of infrastructure deficit that there is, and the fact that with COVID, both government finances have been hit as well as donor finances because of issues in their own home countries have been hit, we suddenly find a situation where there is much less funding available for infrastructure, especially what we call the small and medium scale infrastructure that we concentrate on when we are talking about faster movement of trade. So essentially infrastructure in the range of 10 to 40 million. So not the vanity, okay, not vanity is wrong, not the big mega projects. Mega projects can still find funding potentially, but the 10 to 40 million infrastructure, you're going to find a lot of challenges developing the logistics facilities, the border posts, the small lake ports. Those are going to be hit very badly. So there is need for exploring new sources of funding for developing infrastructure. And in this case, I mean, next slide, please. The next, yeah. We need to think broader. So one is that on infrastructure, sometimes, I mean, even within me and my team, we sometimes tend to become very focused on the infrastructure itself and not really doing the kind of system-wide initiative that is required around infrastructure. So this is something that we did, the Mombasa Port Community Charter, lots of signatories, 52 different signatories that make up the Mombasa Port system. And the performance of each one of them decides how well your infrastructure is going to operate. So any improvement that you do, let's say on the port side, for example, can be very easily defeated by, let's say, a new regulatory agency doing more checks, or the dock workers not performing to the adequate productivity level. So it's very important that the whole system is brought on board and continuously analyzed. So we have a dashboard which looks at the performance by each of these institutions, and there is a forum in which these can be discussed and debated around it. Yes, it doesn't work perfectly, but at least the idea is to recognize that the huge number of institutions that need to work together to make the system more efficient. Next slide, please. So for example, as I was saying, you can have a very efficient infrastructure, but if you look at it, this is for Mombasa Port. We did a very detailed study on the time for each function that happens at the port. And we found that the time that was being taken for documentation was so high that everything else that you could do, so you could invest another $100 million at the port and nothing would improve in terms of the time taken at the port, because the bottleneck was not on the infrastructure side. The bottleneck was somewhere else. Now, for example, here on the second slide, for example, you can see why integrating other stakeholders is important. The box there, a lot of the container dwell time that was happening at the port of Mombasa had nothing to do with the infrastructure itself. If the infrastructure was good enough to turn around the truck at half the time it was taking at the port of Mombasa, but the other entities and agencies and their antiquated processes were leading to the delays. So sometimes an examination of the system is important to first come to the real pain point and not just go for the infrastructure itself. Next slide, please. Then this is the other thing, also on infrastructure. Sometimes when we look at infrastructure, we have very set mindsets around who is going to be the developer of these infrastructure, mostly within the purview of the government. The operator is the government. And what we find is that we end up with infrastructure created but not performing to their optimal levels. Now, this is, for example, a diagram which shows how we can look at infrastructure and split it across its various functions to see who best operates which part of the infrastructure to make it most efficient. For example, there are lots of countries where you see the track itself for the railway is constructed and operated by the government because it has the nature of a monopoly. The trains that run on it, they are timetabled, so the engine is run by a government operator, but the wagons are all for a private company. So for example, Bolloré could have the 9 a.m. container train from Mombasa port to Nairobi. Now, then what happens is Bolloré goes and looks for the cargo and fills up the train. This exercise is something where governments are not very good at. Marketing of the facilities, because what Bolloré can offer is the end-to-end transportation of your cargo from the time it arrives at the port to your warehouse, and using its 9 a.m. slot or some other service. Government only looks at transporting from the port to the ICD in Nairobi, nothing else. You figure out everything from there. Now, so then again, we need to look at who operates that part of the infrastructure that is being created. Then the third part is there are ancillary facilities you need to operate. So the Nairobi ICD, right now we have this one place to operate the containers from. There are many places where there are a number of private sidings that are there for the operation, built by the private sector for specific kind of cargo handling. Here in Nairobi, for example, we bought a number of wagons for carrying grains and cement, which are these two other major cargo that arrive to Nairobi. But we just never built the handling facilities for these cargos. So these have continued to travel by road, even though the track has the capacity, we just don't have the facilities. Now, if you allow private sector to come and develop it, because if you lean on the government budgets, those budgets are not always easily available. So that's why it's also important to break up the infrastructure that is required. So yes, a rail is required. You know, when we discuss an SGR from Dar es Salaam to Kigali, why not look to break it up to see how different agencies can collaborate to create that infrastructure? Next, please. Another one is to look at innovative financing. I think for far too long we have looked at infrastructure as something where governments or donors or some other agency puts in the money, the infrastructure is created, it's run by a government institution, and usually there are few or little user fees. Now, this is a facility that we are doing in Uganda. We have done a similar facility in Rwanda, a logistics facility. So in Rwanda, for example, the cost of the facility was 40 million. We are able to do a PPP structure. There is a user fee, but it's no higher than, there is a whole regulatory framework. The user fees are no higher than the ones which are being charged by the government facility. And Rwanda is able to have a brand new facility. Now, PPPs are quite difficult in our region. We have, I mean, I can discuss experience around that. But the thing is, and having come from different countries in Asia, where I've seen how a lot of these projects have exploded. So for example, for a number of years, we had very few kilometers of roads being constructed through any PPP arrangement. We were still depending on government or donor financing. I think now in India, between the national and the state governments, we have around 5,000 PPP projects, which have transformed the road network of India because of some innovations that were done. One of the biggest ones was to say that we can't keep waiting for international companies to come and invest in infrastructure in our region. Because before we used to do these massive road packages, 600 kilometers of road PPP for one developer. So for example, when we tried to do the Mombasa-Nairobi road, we said 500 kilometers of road, one PPP operator. No local company has the capacity to come and invest in it. So you have to look at an international company. The international company views a lot of risks in Africa. They don't want to sign till everything is stitched up. In India, what was done was a 600-kilometer project was broken up into 6 100-kilometer projects. For a 100-kilometer project, there were a lot of companies who could put that kind of money in. The good thing about local companies was they understand the political risk. They know that if land has not been acquired fully, is that okay or not? No international company will move till the absolute land acquisition has taken place, till all the regulatory things have been stitched up, till the financing for utility removal has been done. But a local company understands how governments work, how things will be, how they will be able to manage, and things have been moved. So again, the thing is, one, we need to look at PPPs, but we also need to look at PPPs more creatively around how can we have African companies who understand our continent, who understand our risks, participate more in the PPP projects by making projects suitable to their capacity, not expecting companies to become so much more capable. It's not possible. We have to help them grow to do more infrastructure. We can't keep getting other companies from other countries to keep coming in, because they will never feel comfortable with the kind of risk profile that we have in our region. Next slide, please. Yeah, then the other thing, and this we were discussing, was sometimes we also need to look at, when we are looking at financing, we also need to look at some other mechanisms of financing. For example, our governments have a lot of value locked in real estate, massive real estate portfolios that we have, but very little thought on how to monetize them for financing. For example, Kenya Railways owns enormous real estate in Kenya, and there are so many innovative models. For example, all of the metro in Hong Kong, the MTR system, is built entirely from real estate development that Metro Rail Corporation does. So any rail that is constructed there in Hong Kong is not through any government financing that comes to them. Instead, they have the right to construct certain apartment buildings, certain shopping malls, and the money from there flows into financing of the core infrastructure that is done. So again, that's something we need to look at. Final slide, please. The next one, please. Yeah. And within Trademark itself, I think we are also now looking to, and I can talk more about that in questions if you have, but essentially, we are ourselves looking to move away from this whole donor model and donor government interaction model where we construct a project, is free of cost to the government and is delivered, to a commercial approach to infrastructure creation. We're looking to set up a subsidiary company, hopefully to be operational by early next year, where we'll be doing some of these infrastructure projects on a project finance basis. So not really relying on the already stretched government budgets, but really based on possible user fees. For example, one of the border posts that we're looking to do, the infrastructure that is needed at the border post needs around $15 to $17 billion of funding. The traffic at the border post is around 800 trucks a day. Now, we have been looking for donor financing for that border for the last 3 years. Not too much success. Government's own capacity to invest in it is not there. However, if we construct that $17 million worth of infrastructure, the time taken to cross the border comes from, right now it is around 32 hours. It'll come down by over 20 hours. Now, the loan that is required from a DFI for that, if that 17 million was to be financed for a tenure of, let's say, 10 years through a DFI, the user fee that would be required to fund that infrastructure is only of the range of $20 to $25 per trip for a truck. The benefit of a 20-hour reduction in the truck not standing at the border for 20 hours, I mean, our own calculations show that if a truck stands for 24 hours, it's around $250 of opportunity cost that you have. So around $200 of benefit of the truck being able to cross that border quicker from the 32 hours down to 5 or 6 hours as it would be with the infrastructure. Now, however, if we just keep relying on donor financing or government financing, the project just doesn't happen, and there's so much economic loss that keeps happening at the border because the trucks are unnecessarily standing. So we have been able to work with some of the DFIs that we partner with to structure a project. The government is also on board to look at this. We have raised some funding of our own, so we are also going to put in some of our own funding on this, and there we'll play the role of a project developer. So really, till now, what we do is we conceptualize projects, we prepare them, and we support their construction and then hand over to the government. Here, we will move from till the construction stage to also incorporating the operation stage, where we look to maintain some of the infrastructure that we create, while the revenue authority will continue to operate the border as they have always done and own the assets. So I think this is something that we are looking to try out as a few models. But if this were, and this not just for border posts, but we are also doing a number of things: agro-logistics facilities, digital infrastructure facilities, everywhere where user fee can be charged. Equipment leasing is another one that we're looking at as a part of this entity. But the idea is that if this is successful, that my first slide where I said, if you need CFTA to happen in Africa, you need borders which will allow that trade to move at low costs. And some of these can really help quicken the pace of infrastructure creation in our region if it works. So again, we are going to pilot some of these, and let's see what is the outcome of it. We'll learn from it, certainly. And so hopefully maybe in one of our other forums, I'll be able to discuss our own experiences there. But yeah, I think with that, that's pretty much it. Looking forward to any questions, comments from you.
Thank you very much, Abhishek from Trademark East Africa, for that presentation. And now we would like to get to the floor and have the participants
Anywhere.
who have a question to Mr. Abhishek or want to make some remarks on the presentation he has made, to go ahead. So the floor is open. Anybody? Okay, we have Sudan. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I have just one question, but I don't know whether this is the right place to ask it. Because that we find that Sudan is not included in the list of countries in which Trademark East Africa is operating. Maybe this has to be, to be related to the fact that we used to have some strains in our relations with some members of the international community during, when the Trademark East Africa was established. Now my question is, do you think that what are the real obstacles on the fact that Sudan is not included in the countries which are covered by Trademark East Africa? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Abhishek, I think once an issue is raised, you immediately respond, then we go on until we finish. Okay, go on and respond to Sudan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, Trademark East Africa, we are not like a regional economic cooperation entity. I mean, it's a small aid for trade organization, and we literally are moving on our mandate. So we had something which we call the good neighbor policy. So we started in the EAC, and then we moved on to countries which had a border with the EAC. So I think it's, at one level, it's, Sudan would be one of the natural steps. It also depends on our donors and how they're looking at the countries. So if we find donor interest, then absolutely that's one of the areas that we would like to look at. I think in a very small way for the project that we're doing with the EU and Igad, which is around safe trade, we are looking at, we are doing some of the PPE distribution at one of the Sudanese borders, but that's literally where we are limited to. But so it depends on a bit on our donor interest. If we find that happening, then this is something that we would definitely look at.
Okay, Abhishek, for that reply. Any more questions? Okay, Uganda, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Abhishek, for your presentation. He has touched on a couple of things, especially on the alternatives of funding and some of the challenges with the PPPs in the region. I would like to echo on issues of alternative financing and the way we still do things. Of course, in our region, originally infrastructure is financed by public finance, and that is the model that we have in financing infrastructure. But we are trying to find out how we can leverage the private sector into the financing of infrastructure. And he has talked about the vertical separation and horizontal separation in terms of running of the infrastructure, which is something that has to come when the environment is not business as usual. Some of these concepts, you cannot bring them when you have not restructured, when you have not done reforms in terms of the way government does things. We are still in the traditional model of doing things, and then we want to bring in new concepts without restructuring the way we do things. That may have challenges to work. It cannot work. There must be a different arrangement, and that is agreed that after undertaking these reforms of vertical separation or horizontal separations, that's when you can now find that the private sector is in the right place, the right playing field. We have tried concessions in the past with the same traditional way of doing things. They never succeeded. Instead, the private sector just ran down the whole of the infrastructure. And from there, government raised red flags and said, something is wrong. We cannot go along that path of concessions. So now when you try to bring about concessions, they say, no. Those things, they don't work. You know? And yet the environment which we brought it is not palatable. It is not the right environment of doing these things. So maybe the donors must first see how do we make the reforms, how do we restructure the way of doing things so that it is appropriate to bring in these concepts and these models. He has talked about financing, alternative sources of financing. You see, this all goes to how developed is your capital market. You know, when we try to do these things, like you look at bonds, capital bonds, treasury bills, all these things, they work with a very developed and effective capital markets that can trade in bonds, and then you can realize the beauty of the bonds. But with the current markets, if you see the capital markets in the region, maybe it's only Nairobi which can qualify in terms of these bonds and dealing in trading in bonds. And these are the alternative ways and means which we could take on and then mobilize other resources. But as long as our capital markets are still just trying to survive, there is no way you can effectively trade in such bonds, treasury bills, and other alternatives of trying to mobilize long-term financing at concessionary rates to fund infrastructure. Even when you talk about most of these Exim banks, they have a very short period of time. Somebody is telling you 15 years. But infrastructure bond, infrastructure, for you to recoup back your investments, it takes long. It's like 30 to 40 years for you to realize it. And these are the challenges that we need as a region to begin working on. Without a developed capital market, we cannot go far. We need developed capital markets that can trade and that we can realize other alternative sources of financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All good points. Just very quick things. I mean, of course, one of the biggest reasons why we need to look at alternative financing is just because government financing and donor financing is not available. So everywhere, wherever we look at it, the model towards PPP or anything else moved only because the other sources of funding dried up. So it's really from necessity. I mean, nobody would prefer one of those models because they are very hard to structure, a lot of stakeholder interaction, government funding, straightforward, you do it. So really, it's the need that's pushing, looking at alternative models rather than any desire to look at alternative models. Now, if you look at, so I just want to take on the second point. For example, you said, the capital market is not developed. You're right. But then I've also know that a lot of the pension funds in our region, which have enormous capital, are looking to invest in our region on different projects. Now, you've seen how the housing sector in Uganda, Rwanda have benefited significantly from this funding that is available. Housing is one of the riskiest fundings that any pension fund can do. Infrastructure, if structured well, can give a more predictable return than some of these kinds of projects. However, because we have not really looked to structure projects through a user fee kind of model in a realistic way, I mean, some of the projects that we end up doing are around cities. The tolling model does not work. There are lots of evidences. So, I mean, there are a lot of lessons that exist around what works, what doesn't work. I mean, lots of developing countries at similar level of development have tried it. So there's a lot of experience that is there. But in our region, there is long-term funding available through some institutions who, if we can structure projects well, would look to invest. Because I know one of the biggest problems with a lot of the pension funds, there is not enough investable areas available to them. Now, just in terms of experience, I'll just relate an experience which I know very well because I've been through the entire cycle of that development. Again, in India, when we started around early 2000s around road development, it took us forever to structure projects. Then we had a few visionary people. Political will was the first thing. Government at that time was very clear that our fiscal space did not allow us to fund infrastructure through government's own funding. The second thing was there was a very visionary man who headed up the, let's say, the PPP unit equivalent on the road, on the side of road construction. Some of the things he did was, first he created what he called a model concession agreement. So any road will have the same concession agreement. It reduced the time because you did not have to develop a new concession agreement for every single project that you did. Second, he made the whole process very structured and the same steps followed for every single process. So then the transaction advisory cost for a project fell from around $200,000 to $300,000 for a project to $10,000 for a project. The time taken to structure a project fell down from 2 to 3 years to 6 months from the time a project was considered to the time it was launched. And then finally, there was a waterfall mechanism that was created where each project was first tested under a PPP to see if there is private sector interest or not. Only if it was not, only if we found that there was no private sector interest, then it moved to any other sort of financing. So every project, the priority was to fund it through a PPP model. Now with that, with some of those tests, and of course there are many more details around it, the number of projects done under this route exploded. The banks also found it really wonderful because you were able to give debt of, let's say, around $50 to $60 million at one go to one entity, which really works very well for banks. And we had a challenge with long tenure funding, but then they were able to revolve the funding through the structure. So even though these debts were, let's say, for 10 years, there was an interest reset clause of every 2 years. So it literally meant that new capital was flowing in every 2 years from the banks. So the banks' tenure issues were solved, but at the same time, because of course, some of the things, a more predictable interest rate environment in the country, the developer was also able to know that the funding band would be within a certain interest rate. So there are things that were done. There are lots of models. I mean, there are a lot of other models in the Asian country. Philippines is another big leader, and we can talk about that. But there are lots of things which can be learned from the experiences of others and look to implement here and also develop some of our own experiences. But the main thing is to try. I think our own experience, we are doing project together in Uganda. Our own experience is that we have already decided that these models don't work, and the private sector is here to loot us. I mean, the private sector just wants to earn a return, and it is how well you structure the process that will decide whether they will loot you or they will give you value for money. So it's really if we are sure from our side that this is a route we want to follow, 100% we can structure many more projects with alternate sources of financing.
Thank you for that very elaborate response. And now, also being a participant, I'd like to inquire from you about the work that Trademark was supporting in Nimule, one-stop border post. There was a completion of phase 1. That was a construction of the verification shed. But there's the remaining phase 2, construction of the main building and other facilities, and also the software part of it. When is Trademark expecting to get back to the, to the implementation of the remaining phases?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear the name of the border post. Is it Moyale? that you're
No, no,
talking
no,
about?
no. It is between Uganda and South Sudan. Uganda.
Oh, Nimule.
Uganda Elegu is
Yeah.
okay and functioning very well, but Nimule, phase 1, the verification sheets have been completed, but the main building and other facilities of the one-stop border post, and also the software part of it,
Yeah.
that is also the internet and the computers and everything, they are still, you know, they are still outstanding. And I was wondering when Trademark is assuming the support.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is something I should be able to answer. It's my own docket. This actually is one of the reasons why we want to move away from this donor funding of infrastructure. So as situations change, like some of the difficulties that happened in South Sudan, donor interests change and the funding availability changes. And also COVID-19 has been quite bad for funding from some of our traditional donors in infrastructure. So it's really the reduction in funding which is preventing us from looking at completing some of the work that you just highlighted. And so now what we're looking at is through this new commercial entity which we want to set up early next year, is to now come up with a structure which is where we have assured funding that is available for a clear mechanism of user fees that are put in. I mean, it might be agreeable or not agreeable to the governments in South Sudan or Uganda, but I mean, on the donor funding side, I mean, this is a reality that we grapple with every day. Sometimes you have funding available, a political situation happens, the funding reduces dramatically or disappears completely, and then projects have to be left at the stage where they are in. So it's that position we are in on that project. We're looking for funding continuously, but the donor interest has changed a bit around that border post.
Okay, any more questions, contribution to the presentation from participants? Seems we are done with this presentation. Over to you, Mr. Brazil, to take us to the next stage.
All right. Thank you so much, Chair.
I think Bishek Shamari needs another heavier round of applause than that. Please help me applaud. Bishek, thank you very much for coming through and for engaging with us. I think you've shared information for some of us who have maybe interacted with Trademark East Africa in a very elementary or very basic way. I think our knowledge level has increased a few notches. So thank you for that, and we will continue to engage. As the question that came from the good ambassador from Sudan, I hope you'll also expand your coverage area, as the former Prime Minister said as part of his opening remark. The big goal, or the elephant in the room, is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So all these efforts that we're making should link. We are looking forward to that day where the Indian Ocean will link up with the Atlantic, and the old dream of our forefathers of having a seamless travel mechanism from Cape Town to Cairo, which I think to some extent we have done, but for it to be seamless and effective will be met sooner than later, while some of us are still alive, I hope. So thank you once again. So that brings us to the end of today's plenary session. But as we have done before, in the previous, from yesterday, we have encouraged people to have bilateral sessions with each other, institutions to try to pick up areas of possible collaboration and cooperation, and therefore we encourage business-to-business interactions among participants. So we are going to that as we have our tea, coffee, and any refreshments that have been made available to us. And tomorrow we start our day up and early, hopefully without putting the horse before the cart. I hope maybe by lunchtime we will have covered sufficient ground, and maybe after lunch people can do a bit of shopping to improve on our local economy. We need some of that DSA money to remain in our beautiful city of Nairobi. So we will not rush you, but we will try to see if we can wrap up at least by lunchtime, so that people can have some time to interact socially and otherwise. So that is all I have. And once again, thank you for your time, Bishak, and all that participated in this discussion. Thank you.